Krista Schlyer is a conservation photographer and storyteller with a special focus on long-term documentary projects. Her work in the US-Mexico borderlands has spanned more than a decade, has included organizing a month-long 15-person documentary expedition along the border. A book, a story map in collaboration with the Esri Story Maps team, and dozens of magazine, newspaper, and digital stories published by the BBC, Orion, Audubon, the Nature Conservancy, High Country News, Newsweek, and more. Krista is the writer, director of the documentary Ay Mariposa, which we will in fact see tonight after her talk, and the author of 3 books, including Continental Divide, Wildlife, People, and the Border Wall, winner of the National Outdoor Book Award and Ansel Award for Conservation Photography. Her book, River of Redemption, Almanac of Life on the Anacostia, published in 2018, also won the National Outdoor Book Award. And for the past 3 years, Krista sailed throughout the Caribbean on her sailboat, Maggie May. Krista, we're delighted to have you, and we're sorry it's keeping you up so late, but I'm sure we'll enjoy it, and hopefully you will too.
Yeah, that's great. It's great to be here. Nice to see you all. Mark and I have been talking about this for many years, so I'm glad to finally be here talking to everybody and about the Borderlands Project. A little bit about my work kind of in general. My focus as a conservation photographer is telling the story of landscapes across North America, from the Mountain West to the pine forests of the Southeast. And the Anacostia River, my own home watershed right here in Washington, D.C., as well as the Caribbean Sea, where I've spent quite a lot of the last 3 years on my sailboat. For me, telling the story of a landscape must be encompassing, wide and deep, the story of ecosystems and all those who live and act upon them. And since 2007, my most enduring focus has been on telling the story of the landscape that spans the US-Mexico border. In 2006, I had a story assignment for Wildlife Conservation magazine, and that's kind of how this whole project started. I went to meet up with a scientist named Rurik List, who was studying the bison herd, because it was one of 5 free-ranging herds of bison left in North America. And it had been, they think, originally introduced by the Wildlife Conservation Society, but had been just kind of forgotten and kind of doing their own thing, traveling between New Mexico and Chihuahua in Mexico. And so I was with Rurik, and we went on a research flight in a Cessna, and we spotted these bison right as they were crossing the border at the time, which was a 3-string barbed wire fence that the bison had broken down so they could cross easily back and forth. And when we saw them, we thought, well, we need to talk to the landowners, you know, where they're traveling. So we got back down on the ground and we went to visit the rancher on the American side. And he said that the bison were basically visiting his land every day to go to a particular kind of grass that they liked. And then we went to the Mexican side and talked to a rancher there who said that they came almost every day to a pond that was one of the only large year-round water resources in the area. And so it was very clear that this bison herd's food and water resources were on opposite sides of the border. And in 2006, the US government passed the Secure Fence Act and was beginning to construct its first segments of border wall. Rurik had kind of known about this happening because he studied large carnivores and other animals that need large ranges, and he was keeping track of what was happening in the US, though he lived in Mexico City. But for me, this was new, and I had heard of it before, but it really didn't impact me the way it did when I saw those bison. And suddenly the pieces fell into place for what this would mean, not just for this bison herd, but for wildlife all along the 2,000-mile border. And I followed the news on this subject, and there was very little discussion of the ecological implications of the policy. So I launched the Borderlands Project, the aim of which was to help policymakers, the news media, and the public better understand and value this relatively unknown landscape. This map of the Borderlands shows the major ecosystems of this region, which you can see are all bisected by the border. These regions are considered by scientists to be some of the most rich and rare ecosystems in North America because they sit within a natural borderlands, the kind of the north and south of the natural world, the temperate zone to the north and the subtropics and the tropics to the south. And in between, there's these ecosystems that are kind of a gradual transition zone between these climate extremes. And because of this transition zone being at the nexus of these greater climate zones, it's a host to ecological communities that don't coexist anywhere else on the planet. And they include the Sonoran Desert with this icon, the saguaro cactus, and the Sky Islands, which are those mountains that sort of rise out of the desert, that they are areas, because they go up in altitude, they get higher rainfall and have cooler temperatures. And so entirely different plant and animal communities live in those mountains than in the desert. And a little bit to the east is the Chihuahuan Desert, which is slightly cooler and wetter climate than the Sonoran, and it harbors some of the last remnants of globally impaired grassland ecosystem, and that is the ecosystem where I saw those bison. And then to the far eastern side of the border is the lower Rio Grande Valley, an extremely rare subtropical thorn forest at the convergence of two of the Western Hemisphere's major avian flyways, the Central Flyway and the Mississippi Flyway. This valley and the borderlands in general are home to a great diversity of wild species. More than 600 species of birds find critical shelter and resources in the last remnants of this ecosystem. They include northern cardinals, green jays, Altamira orioles, which are an endemic species in the South Texas and Tamaulipas area, white-eyed vireos, golden-fronted woodpeckers, as well as a very diverse community of insects, including more than 300 species of butterflies. And more than 100 species of dragonflies and damselflies. The borderlands are home to 5 of North America's 6 cat species, the only place in the United States where this concentration of cats occurs. They include the endangered ocelot, jaguarundi, jaguar. And this photograph of a jaguar was taken by Roy Toft, who's been a partner with me on this project. And it was not taken in the borderlands. It was taken most likely in Brazil, I think. But along with these tropical cats, the borderlands is also host to the more northerly cats, the bobcat and the cougar. I think the only one of North America's 6 cat species that's not there is the lynx. Many other mammal species, of course, like jackrabbits, and keystone species like the black-tailed prairie dog and kit foxes, as well as a gorgeous reptile community, including Gila monsters, many snakes and amphibians, and fence lizards. And of course, human communities that date back 10,000 years from the Come Crudo of the lower Rio Grande Valley to the Tohono O'odham and other native tribes of the Sonoran Desert, as well as a melting pot of the descendants of Spain, Mexico, and the United States. And all of these borderlands residents have been subject over the past decades to an erosive border policy. I've met, many people in the course of this project who've been working to try and, just stem the rise of walls between their communities. This was a pastor named John Fanistil who used to go do masses for families that would meet at the wall because they were separated, half of the family, or some of the family in the United States and some of the family in Mexico. But this border area in particular has become so militarized that he could not do that anymore. This was taken in 2009. And this is Dan Millis, who used to be the director of the Sierra Club Borderlands program, but this photograph of him is at the site of a place where he found a young girl, 13-year-old girl, who had died on her migration pathway. And he would go back there every year and, just honor her life. And this is my friend Scott Nichols, who has been working on Borderlands issues for longer than I have. And he is a resident of McAllen, Texas, not too far from this segment of wall at the World Birding Center. So I thought I'd just do a brief history of the Borderlands as it pertains to wall. A lot of this goes back to NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, which was ratified in the early 1990s and immediately destabilized Mexico's farm economy, casting millions into dire poverty. Millions of people therefore moved northward, where there was always a demand for labor. And in response, the Clinton administration began to crack down on traditional routes of migration through cities like San Diego and El Paso. Under this strategy, which they termed prevention by deterrence, Clinton built the first miles of the US-Mexico border wall. The idea was to make travel so difficult and so dangerous that migrants would give up trying. But desperation drove migrants, and they continued to risk passage despite increasing dangers. I have this put in bold here just because, I think that recent events in the United States from the previous presidency kind of give the idea that the notion of a U.S.-Mexico border wall started with Donald Trump, but it absolutely did not. It started with Bill Clinton. And the presidents since then have just built it more and higher because the policy of prevention by deterrence never worked. In 2005, when fears of 9/11 had reached a fever pitch, the Real ID Act was passed. And it was a broad, far-reaching law. And one little notice provision allowed the Department of Homeland Security to waive all laws to expand the border wall in San Diego. In 2006, the Secure Fence Act passed, mandating that 750 miles of border wall be constructed on the US-Mexico border. And this was essentially a bipartisan bill at that time. But what happened was in 2007, George Bush, he went into office talking about creating friendship with Mexico and better ties and an understanding of, the situation of migration and trying to fix the immigration system. But with Congress mandating he had to build wall and mandating that had to be done in a certain period of time, President Bush took the Real ID authority for waiving laws and he used it to construct border wall all along the US-Mexico border. He waived 40 laws to expedite construction, and it was the largest waiver of law in US history. Now, flash forward from 2009 to today, Presidents Obama and Trump continued wall construction. More than a third of the border now has some form of wall and is estimated to have cost the American taxpayer well over $50 billion. Was that a good bargain? Thousands of ladders have been collected at the border, hundreds of tunnels found under it, and many videos on YouTube of people climbing over it. And this is a place in Organ Pipe Cactus National Monument at the border where the wall has been breached and fixed so many times. You can look down the length of it and you see these little white numbers that are on that black fence post, and those are all the times. They're just dates of when the wall has been fixed by maintenance crews. And a few years back, there was an estimate that that we will spend $20 billion on maintenance alone for the board wall over a 10-year period. But more importantly, in my mind, the greatest costs are not measured in dollars. Militarization of our southern border didn't stop people from coming, but it did greatly increase the number of those who would die. More than 6,000 migrants have died trying to cross this border since militarization began under the Clinton administration. Many were so disfigured by their ordeals that they could not be identified. And thousands lie in unmarked graves in pauper cemeteries throughout the borderlands. There's a group called Humane Borders in Arizona that delivers aid to migrants, but they've also mapped migrant deaths in Pima and Maricopa counties in Arizona. And this map of the human remains of migrants that have been found was from 2016. They've been doing it for a long time, well before 2016. And this is the most recent map, which was done in 2022. Former President Trump did not come up with the idea of wall, but he did take the idea of prevention by deterrence to a new level. Under the Trump administration, the design of the wall basically stayed the same, but the height was increased by some 10 to 12 feet so that it was 30 feet high in most places. And 30 feet is the height where a human body falling most likely results in a fatality or a severe injury. Since the height of the wall was increased in San Diego's Friendship Park, the number of fatalities, severe brain injuries, shattered bones, and terminated pregnancies due to falls from the border wall has skyrocketed from less than a dozen in 2018 to almost 360 in 2023. We will never know how many wild species have died as a result of the barriers. I photographed these bighorn in 2007 when they were visiting one of the only year-round water resources in southwestern Arizona, the Tanahasaltas Pools, which sit less than a mile north of the border and are or were an essential resource for wildlife on both sides of the border. But much of the pathway to this water is now blocked by an 18 to 30 foot high steel wall. In a harsh desert climate with some of the hottest temperatures on Earth, if wildlife can't access water nearby, they will die. One thing I just read tonight is that the Southwest is in the middle of a mega drought that's lasted more than 20 years. And this is the longest drought and the harshest drought that's been recorded since the year 800 AD. It might actually go back further than that, but what is known is that it goes back at least as far as 800 AD, this record drought. It's an issue for all terrestrial wildlife, from this cottontail to javelina.
One point, I saw a pair of javelina traveling along the border for about 100 yards, and they would go up to the wall and they would smell it, and then they would continue walking, and then go up to it and smell it, continue walking. And eventually they turned away. And that, of course, is a problem for those javelina, but it's also a problem from an ecological standpoint because javelina are seed distributors. If they can't move north, then neither can the plants whose seeds they distribute. So a whole ecosystem disruption can come from this barrier.
This is a video that was taken by scientists shortly after the wall was built in Organ Pipe Cactus National Monument in southwestern Arizona. And she watched these Sonoran Desert toads do this over and over again until they died of dehydration or were taken by predators. They just could not get their heads around the idea that this barrier had just suddenly appeared in their habitat. This is a list of the laws that have been waived over much of the borderlands. They include laws to protect species on the verge of extinction, laws protecting the air we breathe, the Safe Drinking Water Act, the National Park Service Organic Act, the Eagle Protection Act, the American Indian Religious Freedom Act, and the Wilderness Act. And this is another photo by Roy Toft. This is a designated roadless wilderness in California, where the Department of Homeland Security has gouged a road because the Wilderness Act no longer applies here. I'm going to go back to this photograph by Roy because I think that the jaguar is such a great symbol of what's happening on the border. There's more than 180 threatened and endangered species that live in the borderlands. But the jaguar really exemplifies the increased peril that they now face, stripped of their Endangered Species Act protections. The jaguar's last hope for restoration in the US is a few remaining migration corridors from a breeding population about 100 miles south of the border. You can kind of see in this map that bend in that U is where the Northern Jaguar Preserve is, and it is the northernmost breeding population of jaguars in the world. The yellow arrows represent photos that were taken in 2016 of new jaguars that went through those tiny little gaps in that red at the border, which represents wall, to make it into the United States. But this is what most of the jaguar's migration pathway now looks like. Wall construction is ongoing, most of the wall being significantly higher than this 18-foot high wall. If this condition continues, the jaguar will lose its last open pathways and all hope of restoration in the United States. So the Borderlands Project has included more than 15 years of documentary photography, writing, speaking, protesting, organized around the notion that people protect what they know and love. So the main goal of the project has been to help people know and love the borderlands through photography and writing and film. An absolutely essential component of the project has been collaboration with partners, including the International League of Conservation Photographers, the North American Nature Photographers Association, several conservation NGOs and universities in Mexico, Defenders of Wildlife, the US EPA, Esri, teachers, friends, family, and my primary nonprofit collaborator, the Sierra Club Borderlands team. In 2008, when the project began, I had recently joined the International League of Conservation Photographers. So I asked 12 photographers and a film crew from the Cornell Lab of Ornithology to join me for a month-long journey along this 2,000-mile border. All the photographers volunteered their time and talents, and their photos became part of the project. Some of these folks here are the Cornell Lab team, some are scientists, but you can see Roy Toft is there, and Jack Dakinga, and Jeff Foote, Kevin Schaefer, Miguel Angel de la Cueva, and Claudius Contreras Cube, some amazing photographers that joined me. And some of you might recognize Chris Linder, who's there on the right side. He did the talk for y'all last month, I believe. And the other person in that photo is Ted Wood. The work of these colleagues has been invaluable over the course of this work. This is a photo by Jeff Foote that shows in 2009 what the border looked like south of those Tanajas Altas pools that I mentioned before. I have not returned to this location since that time. I would imagine that there is now more wall and it's likely been replaced with higher wall, although this was 20 feet high at the time. This photograph I love is from Miguel Ángel de la Cueva. Took this picture of this little girl who's in the hills in Mexico with her donkey collecting sotal for her family, who was a family of sotal gatherers. And this photo by Wendy Shatil was taken with the help of Lighthawk. It was an aerial photo, and it shows the situation in South Texas that is such a tragic situation that I don't know if folks here have been to South Texas, but the Lower Rio Grande Valley National Wildlife Refuge is a project that's been going on for 30 years to try and save what's left of the native habitat in South Texas, because there's so little left of it. And so it's so critical for so many species, and particularly birds and butterflies. And what's happened is that, they call it the string of pearls. It's these tiny little remnants that have either been saved from agriculture and development, or they were farmland that was just painstakingly restored over decades. And the construction of wall, as this photograph shows, is further fragmenting these already very small fragments of habitat. The photos have been used in Congress, at universities, libraries, by advocacy groups and schools from Mississippi to Maine to Oregon. Photos have been used in outreach materials to members of Congress over the past decade, including this pamphlet created by Defenders of Wildlife in 2009 with the photo by Jack Dykinga. I used the expedition images to create a fine art exhibit, which is shown in the U.S. House, Senate, and more than 20 locations nationwide. And the Cornell Lab of Ornithology film was shown at congressional briefings and at exhibit shows across the country. This particular exhibit, we partnered with a migrant rights group and an artist to show a collection of belongings from migrants that had traveled the border, some of which probably made it to their destinations and some of which probably did not. Photos were used in US EPA reports to former presidents Barack Obama and Donald Trump when they were in office to try to help them understand some of the implications of what they were doing. And in 2012, I produced a book called Continental Divide, Wildlife, People, and the Border Wall, which has won 6 literary awards, including the National Outdoor Book Award, the Ansel Adams Award for Conservation Photography. I've worked with partners to deliver more than 400 copies of the book to members of Congress, the White House, and other policymakers. I've given dozens of book talks, including to the Mexican Congress, Yale University, and my mom's 3rd grade reading class in Tucson, Arizona, which was by far the most receptive audience. I usually include ways for people to get involved, from calling Congress to sending postcards. And, showing films. I've worked with probably half a dozen film crews over the years I've been working on this, including this 2016 Days Edge Productions film that's been seen by tens of thousands online and shown in more than 50 film festivals around the world, from Walla Walla to Chattanooga to Paris. This film is where that video of the animated video of the javelinas, they made that for this film. Part of the project has been to help other journalists do research to be able to tell the Borderlands story. I've helped the John Oliver Show with background research as well as imagery. I myself have contributed stories and photos in magazines, newspapers, television, and radio from NPR, the BBC, NBC, High Country News, Newsweek, Orion, CNN, and BBC Wildlife. This story that's shown here was in BBC Wildlife. In 2017, I produced this story map with Esri, which combined photos from the ILCP expedition, as well as text and cartography to take viewers on a journey along the border. This was posted and promoted by Audubon, Defenders of Wildlife, Sierra Club, Earth Justice, and many other partners, and has been viewed more than 100,000 times. So I just have one final project to talk about. It's centered in South Texas. This photograph is from the Lower Rio Grande Valley National Wildlife Refuge. This is the Santa Ana National Wildlife Refuge. It's the largest remaining remnant of endangered Chihuahuan thorn forest left in the United States. It's essential habitat to more than 400 bird species, as well as ocelots, jaguarundis, and many more. And it was the first target of the Trump administration for wall construction in 2017. Less than 5% of the native thorn scrub remains in the lower Rio Grande Valley, and less than 3% of the riparian thorn scrub remains. Most of the landscape now looks like this. And this. And this. This was a National Wildlife Refuge before it was torn down for border wall. And this, also National Wildlife Refuge property. In 2017, when it became clear that Santa Ana was in the Trump bullseye, a coalition of advocates got together to fight. Many of them were local people, but people came from all over the country as well to join in. They gathered on the Rio Grande Levee to make a wall of resistance against the plan. One of the things that's very odd about South Texas is that the wall that's being built is not being built on the border, because the border is the Rio Grande River. And so the wall is actually being built a mile to 2 miles north or inland in the United States of the river. And so that is why they were standing on the levee as opposed to the actual border, because that is where the wall is being built. I worked with Jenny Nichols and Morgan Heim to make a series of films for the effort, including a short called I, Santa Ana, which Sierra Club, Defenders of Wildlife, Center for Biological Diversity, and others used to urge people to call Congress and save Santa Ana. I don't know if you'll remember that time period, but in March 2017, the government had been shut down for a long period because President Trump would not sign a budget bill without border wall, significant funding for border wall being in it. And in March 2017, Congress gave in and gave the president money for the border wall. But for the first time ever, they protected a piece of land from border wall, and it was Santa Ana National Wildlife Refuge. When you start a project like this, you can't really predict the outcomes, however much you plan. And I thought I'd be working on this project for a year, and it's been 17. There have been mostly defeats, if I'm honest, and sadness and grief. But there have also been fights won. And that is always what we have to keep in mind with conservation work. After Ay Santa Ana, Jenny Morgan and I embarked on a bigger project, Ay Mariposa, which tells the story of 3 characters in South Texas, wrapped up tightly in the battle against border wall construction. And that is the film that you will be watching tonight. Well, that's all I have. If anybody has any questions, I'd be happy to answer them for you.
Okay. I just got to admit, I was curious on that last part where the wall is being built a couple of miles inland or north. What is the status then of the land that is sort of now this no man's land, or any idea of how it's being handled, watched, patrolled, or abandoned? I mean,
Yeah, I mean, that's, that's exactly the question. People just call it a no man's land. I mean, it brings up all sorts of challenges. From there are people who live behind the Rio Grande levee. And so, some people, they have family land that dates back to the King of Spain. It was deeded to their families back when the land belonged to Spain. And the land, of course, goes up to the river, but it was before the levee was built. And so their land is on both sides of the levee. And so what's happening is that there's a lot of eminent domain seizures of private land in South Texas, because so many of these people that have these long legacies in South Texas have, large portions of their land on the riverside of the levee. And so many people have had their land seized. Many people are in the process of fighting it. There's other places where they've built a wall. What they're doing is they're kind of cutting out what this was. It was an earthen levee before, and they're cutting out one side of the levee and building like 30 feet of concrete, and then another 18 feet of steel bollards on the top of that. And what it's done in the National Wildlife Refuges is that when there are floods, which there are frequent floods, and some of them last for weeks, the animals that are in that wildlife refuge property cannot escape unless they're birds, and they've found, after some of they found Texas tortoises, which are an imperiled, state endangered species. Their shells, all over the place, just littered all over the place because they drowned because they couldn't get out. So the putting the wall and changing the nature of the levee has created all sorts of problems, from private property, from farmers not knowing how they're going to get their pumps to the water, because they put their pumps in the Rio Grande River and they pump the water up to where their farm fields are. And if their farm fields are on, the other side of the wall from the river, then they have no way to get water. I mean, there's a whole host of problems that have come along with this situation down there.
I have a question about Ay Mariposa. So I think the film is dated like 2018. Is that right? It has a little bit of text at the end, sort of trying to. I mean, it's a fabulous, beautiful story in many ways. And then there's some sort of update things at the end that describe recent events. However, there's a big gap between 2018 and now. The web today, and based on the way the movie ended, I wouldn't have thought there would never be any more a National Butterfly Center. But I went on the web this morning, and there certainly is a website. And since you will hopefully be asleep by the time we reach the end of the movie, maybe you could give us a little update on where things stand with the National Butterfly Center.
That's a great question. One of the challenges of making that film was that we had to end it, but there is no ending to this story. And so I'm trying to remember. It's actually been a while since I've seen exactly what it said. But I think, if I remember right, the basics of it are true still. Many places wall has been built, but I do not believe that it's been built on the National Butterfly Center as of yet. One of the things, so I mentioned that Santa Ana National Wildlife was pulled out of the congressional funding. And the following year, that was 2017, the following year, Congress added 4 more properties that the Trump administration could not build wall. So it was tied to the funding. So the funding was provided, but it said stipulated you cannot build here. One of those places was the National Butterfly Center. So the money that was provided under the congressional budget between 2017 and the end of the Trump administration, basically it said you cannot build the National Butterfly Center, Santa Ana National Wildlife Refuge, and a couple of other, 5 total properties in South Texas. And no new funding has been provided for border wall since that time. And so I think that for now, the National Butterfly Center is safe, in the sense that it doesn't have wall and it won't see wall until new funding is provided. But it is, they constantly deal with militarization. Border Patrol agents, telling people they have to leave Butterfly Center property and, things like that. And so it's very hard to keep the center open just because of that kind of harassment of the people that are coming there to see butterflies.
Okay, that's great, because I wouldn't have gathered that from what was in the film, so, because it had to stop, like you said, so. What is how many further decades are you planning to be involved with this project?
Well, I was gone for 3 years, and I had a lot of time to think about that question. And I think I came back and I just decided I'm going to continue with it as long as it's happening, and as long as I feel I have something, I feel I have the urge to try and be a part of this, this struggle. So yeah, it could be decades more. I don't know. Hard to say. I think the issue is going to be around for a long time, so.
Well, thank you for all the decades already passed and for the future time as well. It's an amazing, practical lifelong project. So,
I'm just curious, are you working with any conservation groups from Mexico? Are they working with you in terms of what you've been discussing?
Yeah, I've been working, I've worked a lot with universities in Mexico, and to some extent, some of the gatherings that I've been a part of have been funded by, or there's been involvement by some of the NGOs in Mexico. And actually, I think this is terrible that I can't remember this, but it was a long time ago in my defense. One of the major Mexican conservation organizations was one of the funders for the Borderlands expedition that I did with ILCP. So I do work with them. And most recently, I've been asked by some of the conservation groups in Mexico to come actually this month and be a part of a panel on border wall for the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species, the CITES organization, to try and get this organization to make a statement about border walls worldwide and how detrimental they are to international biodiversity. So I might be going to Mexico City in a week to meet up with some of those conservation organizations and try to lobby people to make some international statement about what's going on with borders worldwide. I mean, it really is an epidemic at this point. Our border wall has really caught on, in different parts of the world, and in some places, the United States is even helping to fund some of these border walls in other places in the world. So yeah, it's something that it's expanding, it's continuing to catch on, and hopefully at the same time, the consciousness of what it means is also starting to be, gain some momentum. That's the hope anyway.
Thank you.
Mark, can I ask a question?
Of course.
Krista, this powerful work that you're doing, how do you continue to do it despite the grief and the sorrow? I mean, just in hearing your story here, I mean, the story of everything you've been through and all the observations of the species that are suffering, including human species. How do you continue your work emotionally? How do you do it? What do you do to keep on, keep on?
Oh, well, yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I'm very motivated by my photographs, really. I mean, I have made very kind of personal connections with the wildlife that I photograph and the people that I photograph and the women in the film that you'll see tonight. These kind of relationships, the relationships with the other people that are doing this work in the Borderlands, that's what keeps me going for sure, because it is, I am a little bit tired, so there is that, but you can hear it in my voice that it is a heavy subject and heavy experiences over the years, and more heaviness on the horizon for sure. And one of the things I did was I took 3 years off. I got on a sailboat and I did my very best to not think about it for 3 years. And I think I probably saved myself by doing that, because I just don't think I was in a good place when I was getting ready to leave. I needed to get some perspective and gain some energy and just sort of regain my momentum for the project.
Thank you so much for what you're doing.
Thank you all. And just to say, if anybody has any questions they didn't get to ask, my email's up there, and just send me an email and stay in touch. And thanks so much for listening tonight.